Look, there are some things in life that you know are going to go to shit just by the smell of them. And that day started off smelling like trouble. Ever since I moved to this neighborhood, I've always been nice, kept my space well looked after, didn't give a damn about neighborhood gossip, and avoided anything that smelled like trouble. But of course, there's always that one person who thinks they're in charge of the street, the neighborhood, the planet. And that person had a first and last name. But for the sake of simplicity, let's just call her that insufferable woman. She was the self-proclaimed president of the neighborhood association, a figure who took her position more seriously than a head of state. She had that stuck-up manner, walked up and down with a clipboard, as if she were a UN inspector, and thought that everything needed her approval. The problem? My fence. My house has a big yard, very spacious, and I've always liked to keep everything enclosed, not just for safety's sake, but because my 3 Rottweilers, trained, disciplined dogs who don't take kindly to trespassers, live inside. But for this woman, my tall, dark wooden fence was an aesthetic problem for the neighborhood. Apparently, the neighborhood needed to have a uniform look, and my fence, which had been in the same place for years, didn't fit in with the suburban architecture magazine style she wanted to impose. Of course, she had tried a few approaches before. First, there were the letters. Dear resident, we would like to discuss the visual harmonization of your property with the other homes in the community. Then came the surprise visits, where she would show up at my gate with that forced smile, trying to convince me that a lower fence would be more welcoming. Always with that speech that only a certain type of person can make without choking on their own hypocrisy. Except that I ignored all these advances. My house, my rules, period. But for her, full stop was just the beginning. That morning, I woke up to a noise that shouldn't have been there. The sound of wood cracking, voices giving orders, an engine running. I got out of bed feeling a chill run down my spine. When I got to the window and looked out into the yard, I almost had a stroke. The fence, my fence, it was no longer there. Instead, there was a group of workmen, very calm, taking down the last few pieces, as if they were dismantling a market stall. And there she was, standing in the middle of my lawn, supervising the work with an air of satisfaction that made me want to laugh with nervousness. I don't know exactly what went through my head in the next few seconds, but I do know that I left the house like a hurricane. As soon as I set foot in the yard, one of the workers looked at me and stopped what he was doing. The others stopped too, one by one, because it was impossible to ignore the expression of pure hatred and disbelief that must have been on my face. And the owner of the party? Oh, she didn't even blink. "Ah, good morning," she said in a sweet voice, as if she were greeting me at a Sunday brunch. "Finally, we've solved that little problem with the fence." Little problem. My fence, which cost a fortune to install, which was there to protect my house, my dogs, my privacy, was a little problem. The first thing I did was look at the gate, which was still intact. That meant my dogs were still inside, and that was the only reason those workers were still in one piece. "Have you gone mad?" was all I managed to say at first, and the woman, completely immune to the weight of her own stupidity, smiled. "Well, according to the association's new guidelines, fences higher than 1.5 meters are forbidden. So I thought I'd better sort it out for you. She spoke as if she were doing me a favor, as if she were relieving me of a burden, as if I should thank her for trespassing on my property and destroying something that didn't concern her. The anger that rose up in me was so great that for a second I thought I was going to lose my mind right then and there. But instead, I took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and did something very simple. I turned to the gate, and I opened it. You know that moment when you realize you've made a monumental mistake, but it's too late to turn back. Well, I saw it happen in real time. As soon as I unlocked the gate, there was an immediate change in the air. The workers, who until then had been ripping out the last bits of my fence as if it were just a job, suddenly stopped. It wasn't out of politeness. It was pure survival instinct. Because, my friends, on the other side of that opening, there were 3 Rottweilers who, until that moment, had just been watching the mess without understanding anything. The dogs didn't move in immediately because they're not idiots. They're trained. They can tell the difference between a friend and a threat. But one thing was clear. They weren't enjoying the scene at all. Well, I was savoring every second of the panic that began to spread among the invaders. The first to move was one of the workers, a skinny guy holding a piece of wood in his hand. He looked at the woman, looked at the dogs, and, like any sensible person, began to back away slowly. The second was an older guy, probably the head of the group, who understood right away that the job was over. But the woman, that one took a little longer to process. "You can't let them go," she said, trying to maintain her authoritative tone, but with an obvious change in her voice. "This is dangerous. They could hurt someone." I held back my laughter. Because, you see, the irony here was simply delicious. "Oh, now you're worried about safety?" I replied, crossing my arms. "After having my fence destroyed without warning? After trespassing on my property without permission? Funny, isn't it?" She tried to regain her poise, but I could see the fear growing in her eyes. And the dogs? They were completely still, shoulders tense, attentive to the intruder's every move. They didn't bark, they didn't growl, they just watched, which, honestly, was much more frightening. By now, the workers were ready to get out of there as quickly as possible. One of them even dropped one of the pieces of equipment on the floor, so nervous was he. Their boss looked at the woman and, in a rare moment of common sense, said, "Look, I think that's enough for today. We'll take it from here." But she didn't want to accept defeat. Of course she didn't, because people like that never accept. "No," she insisted, stepping forward as if trying to reassert her authority. "That fence can't be rebuilt. It's against the association's rules. I won't allow it." She didn't even finish her sentence, because it was at that very moment that one of my Rottweilers, Rex, decided he'd had enough of this nonsense and took a step forward. Just one step, nothing aggressive, just a warning. And that was enough. The woman froze in place. Her face went as white as a ghost, and for the first time all day she seemed to understand that she had crossed a serious line. The workers didn't even wait to see what would happen next. They were already rushing to their trucks, throwing tools around as if an army was coming after them. But the icing on the cake was when the woman, in a last act of desperation, turned to me and let out a pearl. "I'm going to call the police." If there was one thing I didn't expect to hear, it was that. She, who destroyed my fence without warning, who invaded my property as if she owned the neighborhood, now wanted to call the police because my dogs were in my yard. I laughed. I couldn't help it. It was one of those laughs that comes out before you even realize it. How absurd it all was. "Great," I said, picking up my cell phone. "Do you want me to call for you?" She stammered something about public danger, about responsibility. But by then, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she finally understood that she had gotten herself into a mess from which she would not emerge victorious. With no other option, she turned on her heels and marched towards her house, fast and furious, without looking back. Well, I closed the gate calmly, petted my dogs, who were now more relaxed, and started thinking about how to turn this situation into a big problem for her. Because, if there was one thing this woman didn't know, it was that I'm extremely persistent. And this story was far from over. The neighborhood has a funny way of behaving when trouble breaks out. Everyone pretends not to be paying attention, but suddenly the curtains on the windows open a little wider. People take longer to check the mail, and even the dogs are taken for random walks right in front of the troublesome neighbor's house. And after my fence fiasco, that's what was happening. The woman managed to turn her name into a synonym for a joke in less than 24 hours. It was inevitable. What began as an authoritarian attempt to improve the aesthetics of the neighborhood became a free show for everyone who was already fed up with her. And believe me, there weren't many of them. But she wasn't going to accept this defeat quietly. Of course she wasn't, because the kind of people who love to dictate in other people's lives never think they're wrong. In her mind, it wasn't trespassing. It wasn't an abuse of authority. It wasn't a blatant violation of my rights. No, in her distorted view, I was the problem, and she was going to try to fix it. Early the next morning, she did what anyone at that level of self-centeredness would do. She started a campaign against me. First, there were the emails. Yes, emails. Generic messages sent to the Residents Association group talking about the importance of collective security and how some residents are keeping potentially dangerous animals without considering the impact on the community. Then came the formal complaints. She tried to use her position as president of the association to give me hell in every possible way. She registered complaints about my dogs, about suspicious noises coming from my house, about anything that could be used against me. Even the position of my trash cans on the sidewalk became a reason to file a complaint. But the best part came when she decided to go for the psychological terror strategy. The following afternoon, as soon as I returned from the market, I found a notice stuck to my door. Dear resident, according to the association's guidelines, the ownership of large dogs considered a risk to the community must be analyzed on a case-by-case basis. We ask that you provide complete training and licensing documentation for your animals within 48 hours. Otherwise, appropriate measures may be taken. Sincerely, Association Management. I had a good laugh before ripping that paper off the door. Appropriate measures could be taken? Was that a threat? Was that what it was? First of all, who the hell did she think she was to demand anything from my dogs? Secondly, if she'd done the slightest bit of research before spouting off with orders, she would have known that my Rottweilers had all their paperwork in order, trained, licensed, and, ironically, better behaved than half the humans in this neighborhood. But the best part? She had no real authority to do any of that, and that's where I was going to catch her. While she was trying to make my life a living hell, I made sure to return the favor. I took all the evidence I had, her previous messages, her emails, the accounts of the neighbors who had witnessed the illegal demolition of my fence, and took it straight to the police station. It wasn't just a matter of vandalism or abuse of power. It was a clear case of trespass and destruction of private property. The police officer who attended to me listened to the story with the look of someone who has dealt with this type of person before. When I'd finished telling him everything, he let out a long sigh and said, "So you mean she had your fence destroyed without permission, tried to evict your dogs, and is still threatening you?" "Exactly." He scratched his head, shook his head slowly, and said, "Well, it looks like we have a criminal complaint to file, and that's exactly what happened. Best of all, some neighbors, who had been waiting for an opportunity to get rid of the woman, started showing up with similar stories. Arbitrary fines, absurd decisions, ridiculous harassment because someone painted the house a color she didn't like. In other words, she didn't just have a problem with me, she had a problem with the whole neighborhood, and now that problem was arriving on her doorstep with a badge and a warrant. The next morning, I was woken up by the sound of cars parking in the street. I looked out of the window, and there they were, two policemen talking calmly to the woman on the balcony of her house. She tried to maintain that arrogant tone, that "I'm important, I know the rules, you can't do this" way, but you could see from the way she held her clipboard that she was already losing control of the situation. The discussion lasted a few minutes, and then it happened. She was handcuffed. Simple, straightforward, no fanfare. The neighborhood? Well, I'm not going to say that anyone openly celebrated, but suddenly the morning walks got a little longer. People found a way to water the plants, right then and there. As a concerned citizen myself, I decided to go out and get my newspaper and see what the weather was like. And the weather? Oh, the weather was fine. The woman was put into the car with the same expression as someone who has just found out that their birthday cake has been burnt. The officers got into the car, started the engine, and, with a formal nod, drove off down the street. And just like that, the neighborhood finally had some peace. But there was still one last thing to sort out: my fence. Because now that the Queen of Norms was off the board, I was going to build the most imposing fucking fence this neighborhood has ever seen. And I wanted to see who would have the guts to say anything. Life has a funny way of reminding us that the universe sometimes works in our favor. After the public humiliation, the car carrying that woman away, and the buzz in the neighborhood, I could finally breathe in peace. But there was still one detail to resolve: my fence, the innocent victim of this absurd story. The demolition had left my yard completely exposed. My dogs weren't used to seeing so many people on the sidewalk, and I could feel their discomfort. They weren't aggressive, just restless, trying to understand why the world suddenly had free access to our privacy. Not to mention the people who, now without any barriers, passed by staring as if my house were a tourist attraction. The fence needed to come back, and this time it would be bigger, sturdier, and, above all, unquestionable. I contacted a specialized team, and the next day we had a project. No suburban fence to please the sensitive eyes of the moralists on duty. It would be 3 meters high, reinforced wood, and, to prevent any further incidents, security cameras at strategic points. If anyone ever decided to play at demolition again, I would have every frame recorded so that I could process the wretch's soul. Of course, the neighborhood was still in a state of shock at what had happened. I've never seen so many elderly people playing the athlete just to walk around in front of my house and watch the work begin. There was even a couple who made small talk, pretending they were just admiring the landscape. Deep down, I knew they were curious to know if that woman was going to try something from beyond the grave. And, well, in a way, she did. The woman was released after a few hours, just long enough to make a fuss at the police station, cry indignantly, and utter that classic phrase of people who have never faced any consequences in their lives: "You don't know who you're dealing with." But in the end, they did, and nobody cared. When she returned home, something was different about her. Her walk was no longer as firm. Her posture no longer shouted authority. It was as if, for the first time, she had understood that she wasn't unbeatable. But that didn't mean she was going to give up. Rumors began to circulate quickly. They said she was going to sue the association, that she was preparing a dossier with irregularities to take to court, that she had friends in the town hall who were going to sort everything out for her. But the problem was that, after so many years of being the neighborhood dictator, no one was on her side anymore. Even the lobbyists were pretending they didn't even know the woman. She tried to rally support, sent emails, tried to convince some residents that I represented an imminent danger, but the only response she got was silence. Time went by, my fence was finished, and she became more and more isolated. No one wanted to be associated with the walking ruin it had become. Even those who had been afraid of her in the past now just shook their heads and got on with their lives. It was as if, overnight, she had become invisible. And, oh, how she hated it. I saw her a few times, standing in front of the house, looking at my new fence as if she could knock it down with the force of her mind. But she didn't dare approach. She didn't dare say a word. With each passing day, her fury seemed to wither a little more. The energy of someone who had always been in control now crumbled into thin air, with nothing to hold on to. And then, one fine day, it happened. A moving truck parked in front of her house. Some people got out, started loading boxes, furniture, everything into the vehicle. The neighborhood, of course, noticed on the spot. Suddenly, the neighborhood was full of people watering plants that didn't even exist, or washing their cars for the 3rd time in a week. The woman left the house carrying a suitcase, wearing sunglasses, as if she were a celebrity on the run from the press. But the truth was obvious. She was leaving, and nobody said anything. No one offered help. No one was sorry. The move was quick. No goodbyes, no waves. Just a woman who had spent years trying to control every detail of the neighborhood, leaving as if she had never existed. When the truck turned the corner and disappeared from view, a neighbor, who had always been one of her favorite targets, grabbed a beer and toasted alone in the backyard. Little by little, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. The invisible tension that existed there simply evaporated. People who had previously avoided conversation now greeted each other, exchanged ideas about fences, renovations, and gardens. The neighborhood, which for so long had been a kind of mini-dictatorship, was finally breathing. Well, I sat on the balcony with my 3 dogs by my side, looking at my new impeccable fence, and savored the sweet feeling of victory. And if you liked this video, don't forget to leave your like and comment below.